A fat 16-year-old was sold to a mountain man as punishment by her father, and what he did next shocked the entire frontier. In the snowbound mining town, a cruel man trades his own daughter for $5 silver, laughing as the townsfolk jeer. Everyone expects the mountain man to claim her like property, but instead, he wraps his coat around her shoulders and says, "You're safe now." As they disappear into the frozen wilderness, whispers spread through the saloon and the church pews. Why would a man known for his silence risk everything to protect a girl no one wanted? When her father returns with a gun, justice turns upside down, and the girl must choose: stay silent or speak the truth that could destroy them both. Beneath the blizzard, mercy burns brighter than revenge. But in a world ruled by pride and shame, kindness can be the most dangerous act of all. Can one man's decency redeem a soul the world has thrown away, or will mercy itself cost them everything? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek's muddy main street as snowflakes began to drift down from steel-gray clouds. Ember Trask's teeth chattered as she stood atop a wooden crate outside the Red Dog Saloon, her thin calico dress offering little protection against the biting December wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to still her trembling, though whether from cold or shame, she couldn't tell anymore. $5, her father's voice boomed across the gathering crowd, slurred with whiskey. "That's all I'm asking for this lazy, useless girl?" Jeremiah Trask swayed on his feet, his once fine coat now threadbare and stained. "Can't even keep a proper house, just sits around reading them picture books all day." Ember's cheeks burned despite the cold. She kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots, unable to meet the mocking stares of the miners and cowboys who'd gathered to watch her humiliation. The sound of their laughter cut deeper than the winter wind. Sheriff Amos Boyd stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face tight with discomfort. His badge gleamed dully in the fading light, but he made no move to intervene. There was no law against a father disposing of his property as he saw fit, even if that property was his own flesh and blood. "Ain't worth the food she eats," Jeremiah continued, grabbing Ember's arm roughly to turn her around. "But she's strong enough for work, got good teeth, and she's only 15. Somebody must have use for her." More coarse laughter rippled through the crowd. A few men called out crude suggestions that made Ember's stomach turn. She caught glimpses of women hurrying past, their skirts swishing as they averted their eyes, perhaps thanking Providence it wasn't their daughter on display. The snow fell harder now, collecting on Ember's dark hair and shoulders. She remembered her mother's stories about angels' tears turning to snow when they witnessed human cruelty. Mama had died 3 years ago, taking her gentle ways and quiet strength with her. Since then, Pa had fallen deeper into drink and debt, his bitterness growing like frost on a window pane. The crunch of boots in snow cut through the jeering. A tall figure moved through the crowd, which parted instinctively before him. Ember risked a glance and saw a man she'd only glimpsed before, the mountain trapper who came to town a few times each year to trade furs and supply the general store with fresh meat. Diego Hale stood a head taller than most men present, his broad shoulders wrapped in a worn buckskin coat. His dark hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that caught Ember's attention, deep brown and steady, holding neither mockery nor lust as they met hers. $5, you say?" His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Jeremiah Trask's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "That's right. $5 silver and she's yours to do with as you please." He leered, encouraging more snickers from the onlookers. Diego counted out $5 silver deliberately, each coin clicking against the others in his palm. The sound seemed to echo in the snowy silence. "I'll take her," he said simply, extending his hand with the money. Jeremiah snatched the coins quickly, as if afraid the offer might be withdrawn. He didn't even count them before shoving them into his vest pocket. The crowd's attention shifted, anticipating entertainment from what they assumed would follow. But Diego ignored them all. He shrugged off his heavy coat and, with unexpected gentleness, wrapped it around Ember's shoulders. The warmth of the buckskin and the clean scent of pine needles enveloped her, along with something else she hadn't felt in years: safety. "If you'll come with me, miss," Diego said softly, offering his hand to help her down from the crate. His calloused palm was warm and steady as she stepped down, her legs shaky from standing so long in the cold. Jeremiah had already turned away, heading back into the saloon without a backward glance at his daughter. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the lack of spectacle, though some still watched with curious eyes as Diego led Ember toward the hitching post where his mule-drawn sled waited. Sheriff Boyd pushed away from the post he'd been leaning against and intercepted them. "Hail," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "You sure about this?" Diego met the lawman's questioning gaze. "I am." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Ember, then back to Diego. "You've got a reputation as an honest man. See that stays true." "It will." Diego's words carried the weight of a vow. The sled was loaded with furs and supplies, but Diego had arranged some blankets on the bench seat. He helped Ember up, tucking the blankets around her legs before taking his place beside her. The mule's harness jingled as Diego picked up the reins. Ember clutched his coat tighter around herself, still struggling to understand how her life had changed so completely in the space of an hour. The sound of the saloon piano grew fainter as they moved down the street, and she felt the stares of townspeople watching from windows and doorways. "I have a cabin," Diego said quietly as they reached the edge of town. "It's a few hours' ride into the mountains. There's plenty of food, and you'll have your own room with a proper bed." He paused, then added, "No one will harm you there." Tears spilled down Ember's cheeks, freezing before they could fall. She nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The sled runners whispered over fresh snow as darkness began to settle over the valley. Behind them, Silver Creek's lights twinkled like fallen stars, growing dimmer with each beat of the mule's steady pace. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing the world in white silence. Ember watched the flakes swirl in the gathering dusk, each one a tiny promise of change. She didn't know what waited at the end of this journey, but for the first time since her mother's death, she felt something stir in her heart that felt remarkably like hope. The mule plodded forward, its breath forming clouds in the cold air. Diego sat straight beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. The sled's runners cut twin paths through the virgin snow, leading away from all Ember had known toward an uncertain future. But as the last light faded from the sky, she realized that uncertainty was preferable to the certainty of shame and degradation she'd left behind. Time seemed to slow in the gathering darkness. The only sounds were the creaking of the sled, the mule's steady breathing, and the soft shush of snow against their runners. Ember found herself swaying gently with the motion, exhaustion from the day's events beginning to weigh on her. "You can sleep if you need to," Diego said softly. "It's still a fair piece to the cabin, and you've had a hard day." Ember nodded gratefully, but hesitated to close her eyes. Part of her feared this might be a dream, that she'd wake to find herself back on that crate, facing the cruel laughter of the crowd. but the warmth of the buckskin coat was real, as was the solid presence of the man beside her. The sled followed a trail that wound gradually upward into the foothills. Through the falling snow, Ember caught glimpses of pine trees standing like sentinels against the night sky. The air grew sharper, cleaner, carrying the scent of evergreen and wood smoke from distant cabins. Diego handled the reins with quiet confidence, guiding the mule around patches of ice and through deeper drifts. He seemed to know every turn of the trail, even in the growing darkness. Occasionally he would murmur soft words of encouragement to the mule in what sounded like Spanish, his voice barely carrying over the whisper of the runners. The snow began to ease as they climbed higher, the clouds parting to reveal a crescent moon that cast silver light across the white landscape. Ember found herself studying her rescuer's profile when she thought he wouldn't notice. There were lines of care around his eyes and mouth, speaking of hardship and loss, but there was also a gentleness in the way he handled the reins, in how he'd wrapped his coat around her without hesitation. "Why?" she finally whispered, the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd stepped forward in the crowd. Diego was quiet for so long, she thought he might not have heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Because it needed doing," he said simply, "and because I remember what it's like to be judged unfairly by folks who don't know your heart." There was a story there, Ember could tell, but she didn't press. She sensed that Diego Hale was a man who shared his thoughts carefully, like someone counting out precious coins. Instead, she pulled his coat closer around her shoulders and watched the moonlit landscape glide past. The sound of coyotes calling in the distance made her start slightly. Diego glanced at her with understanding. "They won't come near," he assured her. "They're just singing to the moon, telling their stories to the night." Something in the way he said it reminded Ember of her mother's tales, the ones that had given meaning to the natural world. For the first time since the afternoon's ordeal began, she felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. They continued their journey through the transformed landscape, the sled cutting its path through pristine snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the moonlight. Ember found her eyelids growing heavy despite her determination to stay awake. The rhythm of the sled and the warmth of the blankets gradually lulled her into a state between waking and dreaming. The last thing she remembered clearly was Diego's quiet voice saying something about being nearly home, and the strange comfort that word brought to her heart. Then she was drifting, wrapped in buckskin and wool, carried through the winter night toward whatever tomorrow might bring. Dawn crept over the eastern horizon as Ember stirred from her slumber. Her first sensation was warmth, cocooned in thick wool blankets that smelled of pine smoke and horses. The sled creaked steadily beneath her, its wooden runners cutting through the frozen trail with a rhythmic swish. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Then yesterday's events crashed over her like ice water. The crowd's jeering faces, her father's cold dismissal, and the quiet mountain man who'd stepped forward to save her from a fate she didn't want to contemplate. Ember shifted carefully, peeking out from beneath the blanket. Diego sat exactly as he had the night before, straight-backed and alert, guiding the mule with gentle commands. His breath fogged in the crystal morning air. When he noticed her stirring, he reached down beside the seat without a word and produced a tin cup. "Coffee's still hot," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Might help with the morning chill." Ember's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. She'd expected harsh words, maybe even cruel demands, but Diego's manner remained as measured as it had been in town. The coffee was strong and black, sweetened with a touch of molasses. Its warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the lingering fear. There's jerky in the bag by your feet, Diego added, gesturing with his chin. Venison. Made it myself last fall. Ember found the leather pouch and pulled out a strip of the dried meat. It was tough but flavorful, spiced with something that reminded her of her mother's cooking. She ate slowly, watching the landscape change as they climbed higher into the mountains. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Their trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, the trees heavy with fresh snow. Occasionally, Diego would point out tracks in the fresh powder: deer, rabbit, and once the distinctive print of a mountain lion. As they rounded a bend, Ember spotted movement ahead. 3 mounted figures appeared on the trail, their horses' hooves breaking through the crusty snow. Her heart quickened, but Diego showed no concern. As they drew closer, she saw they were Ute hunters, rifles across their laps and fresh game tied to their saddles. Diego raised his hand in greeting, speaking words in their language that flowed as naturally as spring water. The hunters responded in kind, their eyes curious but not unfriendly as they studied Ember. One of them, older than the others with gray streaks in his braided hair, exchanged a longer conversation with Diego. Though she couldn't understand the words, the respect between them was clear. After the hunters passed, Diego explained, "That was White Elk. He watches these trails, keeps the peace between his people and the settlers." He adjusted the reins slightly. "Good man to have as a friend up here." The trail began to narrow and climb more steeply as the morning wore on. Pine and spruce replaced the aspen groves, their dark branches offering shelter from the wind. The mule picked its way carefully now, Diego guiding it around patches of ice and deep drifts. Ember found herself holding her breath at particularly steep sections, but the sled never slipped. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Diego began looking for a suitable camping spot. He finally chose a protected hollow beneath several massive spruce trees, their sweeping branches creating a natural shelter. The snow beneath was shallower here, and dead branches lay scattered about. "We'll stop for the night," he announced, bringing the sled to a halt. "Cabin's still a few hours away, but the trail gets tricky, in the dark. Better to wait for morning." Ember climbed down from the sled, her legs stiff from sitting. Without being asked, she began gathering the fallen branches for firewood. It gave her something useful to do, and she was grateful for the activity after the long day of riding. Diego nodded approvingly as she sorted the wood by size, just as her mother had taught her. While Ember collected kindling, Diego tended to the mule, removing its harness and rubbing it down with handfuls of pine needles. He discovered a worn spot on one of the leather straps and settled near the newly built fire to repair it, his big hands surprisingly deft with the awl and sinew he produced from his supplies. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face as he worked. Ember found herself studying him openly for the first time. His beard was shot through with gray, and a long scar ran from his temple to his jaw, partially hidden by his whiskers. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, buckskins and wool, with beadwork on his moccasins that looked Ute in design. But it was his hands that held her attention. They were scarred and calloused, capable of violence, she was sure, yet she'd seen nothing but gentleness in their movement. Even now, as he mended the harness, each stitch was placed with careful precision. A wolf's howl echoed across the mountains, closer than Ember would have liked. She stiffened, scanning the darkness beyond their fire's light. Without looking up from his work, Diego reached beside him and slid his rifle toward her. "If trouble comes, don't be afraid," he said simply. "You'll know what to do." The weight of his trust settled over her like a warm blanket. This man who barely knew her was not only protecting her, but believing in her ability to protect herself if needed. It made no sense. Men like him, strong, capable mountain men, didn't waste time on girls like her. Her father had made that clear enough over the years. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from the night before, but with more courage this time. "Why did you really help me?" Diego's hand stilled on the harness. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. There's enough cruelty in this world without standing by and watching more of it happen. His voice was soft but firm. Sometimes a body just needs someone to step forward and say, "Enough." He resumed his stitching, but Ember sensed there was more to his answer than he was sharing. She wondered what experiences had shaped him, what losses had carved those lines around his eyes. But she didn't press further. Instead, she fed another branch to the fire and watched the sparks spiral up toward the star-filled sky. The night deepened around their camp. Diego showed her how to arrange pine boughs to create a soft bed near the fire, then retired to his own blankets on the other side of the flames. The wolf called once more, but it seemed farther away now. Ember lay awake for a while, watching the firelight dance across the spruce branches overhead. She thought about how different this night was from the previous one. Yesterday, she'd faced public humiliation and the complete abandonment of the one person who should have protected her. Today, she was warm, fed, and guarded by a stranger who asked nothing in return except basic human decency. As sleep began to claim her, Ember heard Diego humming softly, a melody that sounded like a hymn her mother used to sing. The gentle sound followed her into her dreams, where for once she wasn't running or hiding. Instead, she was walking toward something, though she couldn't yet see what it was. She woke to pre-dawn stillness and the smell of coffee. Diego had already rekindled the fire and was preparing a simple breakfast of cornbread and dried apples. They ate in comfortable silence as the sky lightened above the mountain peaks. "Not far now," Diego said as they packed up camp. "You'll see smoke from the chimney when we round the next ridge." Ember nodded, surprised to find herself actually looking forward to reaching their destination. In just 2 days, this quiet mountain man had shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. Whatever waited at his cabin, she was beginning to believe it would be better than what she'd left behind. As they loaded the last of their supplies onto the sled, Ember noticed Diego watching her with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before she caught a glimpse of something in his gaze. Not pity or judgment, but something closer to understanding. The mule's harness jingled as Diego checked the repaired strap one final time. Ember settled into her place on the sled bench, adjusting the blankets around her legs. The morning sun touched the tops of the trees as they set off, the sled's runners cutting fresh tracks in the pristine snow. The sled crested a final ridge, and Ember caught her first glimpse of Diego's homestead nestled in a protected clearing. A simple log cabin stood beside a snow-covered creek, its frozen surface glinting in the morning light. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, dancing against the backdrop of towering pines that surrounded the clearing like watchful sentinels. Diego guided the mule down the gentle slope. As they drew closer, Ember could make out more details: a lean-to-shelter for firewood, stretched pelts hanging from poles, and a small barn that looked newly built. Everything spoke of careful maintenance and solitude. The runners creaked to a stop before the cabin's door. Ember's breath formed little clouds in the crisp mountain air as Diego helped her down from the sled. Her legs felt wobbly after the long journey, and she steadied herself against the rough-hewn wall while Diego began unloading their supplies. A scratching sound came from inside the cabin, followed by a low whine. Diego paused in his work, a slight smile touching his eyes. "That'll be Ghost," he said. Don't be frightened. He looks fearsome but has a gentle heart." He opened the door, and Ember's eyes widened as an enormous gray wolfhound limped out to greet them. Despite his size, there was something dignified about his bearing, even with the pronounced limp in his left hindquarter. The dog's intelligent eyes studied Ember carefully before he approached, tail wagging slowly. "Ghost," Diego called softly, and the wolfhound turned to press his head against his master's hand. "This here's Ember. She's staying with us for a spell." As if understanding the introduction, Ghost padded over to Ember and gently nudged her hand with his nose. She found herself smiling, her first real smile in days, as she stroked his rough fur. "Hello, Ghost," she whispered. Diego carried their supplies inside, and Ember followed, Ghost limping along beside her. The cabin's interior was dim at first, but as her eyes adjusted, she took in the simple, orderly space. A stone hearth dominated one wall, with a cooking pot hanging from an iron arm. Stacked pelts, beaver, fox, and rabbit, lined another wall beneath rows of drying herbs. A narrow bed occupied one corner, while a workbench filled with carpentry tools stood beneath the room's single window. The air held the mingled scents of wood smoke, leather, and dried sage. It was spare but clean, everything in its proper place. Diego immediately set about building up the fire, his movements practiced and efficient. Soon, warmth began spreading through the cabin, and Ember's cold, numbed fingers started to tingle. "There's dry clothes in that chest," Diego said, nodding toward a cedar box near the bed. "They belonged to—" He paused, something flickering across his face. "They'll be big on you, but they're warm. You can change behind that screen while I fix us something to eat." Ember found simple wool skirts and cotton blouses in the chest, along with a soft buckskin dress decorated with careful beadwork. She chose the plainest outfit, not wanting to presume too much. The clothes hung loose on her frame, but Diego was right. They were warm, and far better than her damp things. When she emerged from behind the screen, Diego had a pot of stew warming over the fire. Ghost had settled on a wool blanket near the hearth, his eyes following their movements with quiet attention. The domestic scene felt surreal after the events of the past 2 days. Diego ladled the stew into tin bowls and handed one to Ember along with a spoon. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a rough-hewn chair at the small table. The stew was simple but filling, dried meat, beans, and wild onions that must have been preserved from summer. As they ate, Diego cleared his throat. "You'll stay till spring thaw," he said quietly, his eyes on his bowl. "Then I'll take you to the mission in Durango. Sisters there will help you find your way." Ember's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The matter-of-fact statement struck her anew with the strangeness of her situation. This stranger's unlooked-for kindness, the sudden shift in her fate. She could only nod, not trusting her voice. "Ghost will keep you company when I'm checking trap lines," Diego continued. "He's a good guardian. Knows trouble before it comes." The wolfhound's ears perked up at his name, and Diego tossed him a piece of meat from his stew. After they finished eating, Diego showed her where he kept the supplies: flour and coffee in sealed crocks, dried vegetables hanging in nets from the rafters, salted meat wrapped in oilcloth. Everything organized with the precision of a man used to providing for himself. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, gathering some blankets. "Got a good bed of hay up in the loft, more comfortable than it sounds." Before Ember could protest, he added firmly, "It's proper that way." When Diego had gone, Ember sat on the edge of the narrow bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. Ghost limped over and laid his head on her knee, his presence oddly comforting. Through the cabin's single window, she could see the last light fading from the sky as wind began to rise, whistling through the pine boughs. She knelt beside the bed, clasping her hands as her mother had taught her. The prayer came hesitantly at first, then with growing sureness. She thanked God for this unexpected sanctuary, for the decency of a stranger who asked nothing in return for his protection. Even for Ghost, whose quiet companionship already eased some of her loneliness. The wind rose higher outside, but the cabin's thick walls held firm. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Ghost's steady breathing created a peaceful counterpoint to the storm's voice. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Ember felt truly safe. She slept deeply that night, wrapped in clean blankets that smelled of pine smoke and mountain air. When she woke, pale morning light was filtering through frost-rimed windows, and the storm had passed. Diego had already been up for hours, she guessed, judging by the fresh coffee brewing over the rekindled fire. "Need to check my trap line," he said as he pulled on his coat. "Ghost knows when to be fed. He'll let you know. There's meat and grain in that barrel by the door." He paused, studying her face as if gauging something. "Cabin's yours till I return. Make yourself at home." After he'd gone, Ember stood in the center of the cabin, looking around with new eyes. Everything was orderly but needed attention. Ashes to be cleaned from the hearth, floors to be swept, dishes to be washed. She thought of Diego's quiet kindness, his careful provision for her needs. Ghost sat watching her, his head tilted expectantly. Ember smiled and reached for the barrel Diego had indicated. "Breakfast first for you, friend," she said. "Then we've got work to do." As she measured out Ghost's portion, she felt a sense of purpose settling over her. She couldn't repay Diego's kindness with money or goods, but she could make his home more comfortable, could prove herself useful rather than a burden. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Ghost limped to his bowl and began eating, his tail wagging gently. Ember rolled up her sleeves and reached for the broom she'd spotted in the corner. Outside, the morning sun sparkled on fresh snow, and somewhere in the distance, a jay called out to greet the day. Inside the cabin, Ember began to sweep, her movements becoming more confident with each stroke. She had been given a chance at a new beginning, and she intended to make the most of it. The morning passed quickly as she worked. She swept the floors until they were clean, organized the shelves of dried goods, and carefully banked the fire to keep it burning steadily. Ghost followed her around as she worked, his presence both watchful and encouraging. When she found a worn spot in one of the wool blankets, she took out the sewing kit she'd noticed in the cedar chest and began to mend it with careful stitches. The simple tasks filled her with a quiet satisfaction. Each completed chore felt like a small way of saying thank you, not just to Diego, but to God for leading her to this peaceful mountain sanctuary. As she worked, she hummed her mother's favorite hymns, and even Ghost seemed to appreciate the music, thumping his tail against the floor in time with the gentle melodies. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the mountain cabin. Each morning, Ember woke to find the hearth already stoked, coffee brewing, and Diego preparing to check his trap lines. Ghost would thump his tail against the floor, eager for his breakfast, while frost patterns decorated the single window like delicate lace. Ember discovered an old cast-iron Dutch oven tucked away in a corner. After cleaning it thoroughly, she experimented with cornbread, using the coarse ground meal from Diego's stores. Her first attempts came out burned on the bottom and raw in the middle, but Diego ate them without complaint, saying only, "Better than my cooking." She learned to judge the heat of the coals, to rotate the heavy pot for even baking. Soon, the cabin filled with the warm, homey smell of fresh cornbread most evenings. Diego would return from his trap lines to find a golden brown loaf waiting, steam rising when he broke it open. The work of survival filled their days. Diego showed her how to split kindling with careful strokes, positioning her hands on the axe handle until she found the right grip. "Let the weight of the blade do the work," he explained, demonstrating the smooth motion. "No need to force it." When he brought home fresh hides, Ember learned to scrape them clean with a curved bone tool. It was demanding work that left her arms aching, but she found satisfaction in the methodical strokes, in seeing the pelts grow supple under her hands. Sometimes she hummed as she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her, their familiar melodies filling the quiet cabin. Diego would pause in his own tasks then, his hands stilling on the snowshoes he was repairing. Though he never sang along, Ember noticed how he seemed to find peace in the music, his shoulders relaxing as the gentle tunes drifted through the cabin. One evening, as they sat at the small table sharing a supper of rabbit stew and fresh cornbread, Ember gathered her courage. The question had been burning in her mind since that snowy day in Silver Creek. "Mr. Hale," she began softly, crumbling a piece of cornbread between her fingers. "Why did you—" she swallowed hard. "Why did you buy me that day?" Diego set down his spoon, his eyes distant. The fire popped and crackled in the silence that stretched between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Because no one else there would have treated you human." Ember felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering the jeering crowd, her father's cold dismissal. Diego's quiet words held more kindness than she'd known in years. But then his voice broke slightly as he added, "Had a wife once. She'd have wanted me to." The pain in those simple words made Ember's heart ache. She watched as Diego pushed back from the table and walked to the window, his broad shoulders tense. Ghost rose from his place by the fire and pressed against Diego's leg, offering silent comfort. In the weeks that followed, Ember began to see the shape of that old grief in 100 small ways, in the carefully preserved women's clothing in the cedar chest, in the beaded dress she hadn't dared to touch, in the way Diego sometimes paused in his work, lost in memory. But their days continued in their peaceful rhythm. Ember left carefully mended mittens by Diego's bed in the barn. He responded by teaching her to read weather signs in the clouds, to recognize animal tracks in the snow, to gauge how much wood they'd need stored before the next storm. They fell into the habit of saying grace before meals, Diego's deep voice joining her softer one in simple thanks. These shared prayers seemed to ease something in both of them, her loneliness, his sorrow. When the big storm came, it closed in fast. Diego barely made it back from checking his trap lines before the snow began falling in earnest. The wind howled for 3 days, piling drifts high against the cabin walls. Inside, they kept the fire well fed. Ghost sprawled contentedly before the hearth. On the second evening, as the storm raged outside, Ember noticed Diego's worn Bible on a shelf. The leather cover was cracked with age and use, the pages dog-eared. She reached for it hesitantly, glancing at Diego for permission. He nodded, something softening in his expression. "My mother taught me to read from that book," he said quietly. "Later, I taught my wife." Ember settled in the chair near the fire, Ghost's head resting on her feet. The lamp cast a warm circle of light as she carefully opened the Bible. Her reading wasn't strong, she'd had little schooling, but she'd learned her letters from her mother using hymn sheets and scripture verses. "In the beginning," she started, her voice trembling slightly, "God created the heaven and the earth." The familiar words grew steadier as she continued, though she had to sound out some of the longer ones. Diego sat silently in the shadows beyond the lamplight, whittling a piece of wood. But she could feel him listening, not with judgment, but with a kind of peaceful attention that gave her confidence. Each evening of the storm, She read a little more. When she stumbled over difficult words, Diego would quietly supply them, his deep voice gentle. The howling wind outside made the cabin feel like a sanctuary, wrapped in warmth and lamplight and ancient words of comfort. Ghost moved between them as she read, sometimes laying his head in Diego's lap, sometimes pressing against her legs. His presence seemed to bridge the space between them, connecting their separate solitudes. By the third day, the storm began to ease. They could hear the wind dying down, the soft shushing of settling snow. The forced confinement had changed something between them, not dramatically, but in the small ways that matter. There was more ease in their shared silences, more understanding in their brief exchanges. That evening, as Ember fixed a simple supper of beans and the last of the cornbread, Diego worked at his wooden bench, carefully shaping new snowshoe frames. The familiar sounds of their evening routine filled the cabin. The scrape of Diego's knife on wood, the clatter of tin plates, Ghost's contented sighs by the fire. Ember found herself humming again as she worked, an old hymn about grace and shelter from the storm. After a moment, she heard Diego's deep voice quietly joining in on the chorus, rough but true. Their voices blended in the warm air of the cabin, carrying all the things they couldn't yet say about loss and healing and finding family in unexpected places. The evening settled around them like a soft blanket, Ghost drowsing by the fire, the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls, the last notes of the hymn fading into comfortable silence. Outside, stars began to emerge in the clearing sky, glinting like diamonds in the cold mountain air. Inside, the cabin held its own kind of peace, built of small kindnesses and shared prayers and the slow healing of wounded hearts. Ember stirred the beans one last time and glanced at Diego, still working steadily at his bench. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, the old sorrow in his face, but also the quiet strength that had saved her that snowy day in Silver Creek. She sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for this shelter, for Ghost's faithful presence, for the mysterious ways God worked to bring healing to broken lives. The beans were ready. She reached for the tin plates, and another evening began in their mountain sanctuary, where trust grew like winter wheat under snow, slowly but surely putting down roots that would bloom when spring came. The late February sun glinted off the crusty snow, casting long shadows across the mountain valley. Inside the cabin, Ember hummed softly while kneading dough for the morning's biscuits. Diego had already gone out to check his trap lines, leaving Ghost to guard the cabin. The big wolfhound dozed by the hearth, one ear cocked toward the door. Suddenly, Ghost lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ember paused in her work, flour dusting her hands as she listened. The sound came clearly now, hoofbeats crunching through the snow-crusted valley, more than one horse approaching. Her heart began to pound. In all these weeks, they'd had no visitors, except the occasional Ute hunter trading pelts. Diego had warned her that few people knew the location of his cabin, and those who did respected his privacy. Ghost was on his feet now, hackles raised as he moved to the window. Ember wiped her hands on her apron and joined him, peering out through the frosted glass. 3 riders were making their way up the narrow trail, their horses picking carefully through the deep snow. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold. The man in front, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill, was unmistakable. Jeremiah Trask, her father. The cabin door burst open as Diego strode in, his face grim. He must have spotted the riders from his trap line. "Stay inside," he told her quietly, reaching for his rifle. Ghost padded to his side, still growling. "It's my father," Ember whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is he here?" Diego's jaw tightened as he checked his rifle's loading. Likely heard about the silver strike near Durango. Probably figures he can sell you again for more than $5 this time. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Ghost's growl grew louder as boots crunched in the snow, approaching the cabin. Diego stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready. Ember moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hale!" Her father's voice rang out, slurred with what she recognized as morning whiskey. "You bring my girl out here right now." "Your girl?" Diego's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "The one you sold in front of the whole town?" Jeremiah spat in the snow. His companions, rough-looking men Ember didn't recognize, shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near their gun belts. "That was a misunderstanding," Jeremiah called out. "I was drunk. You took advantage, kidnapped my only child." "That's not true!" Ember couldn't stay silent any longer. She pushed past Diego onto the porch, Ghost pressing protectively against her legs. "You sold me like cattle. Mr. Hale saved me from worse men who would have— Get down here, girl!" Jeremiah's face was red with rage, or whiskey, or both. "I'm your father, and you'll do as I say." Diego stepped forward, placing himself between Ember and the men. "Miss Trask is free to leave if she chooses," he said evenly, "but she's also free to stay. She's not property to be sold." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Ember declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "You sold me. You gave up any right to call yourself my father." One of Jeremiah's companions laughed harshly. "Looks like the half-breed's turned her against you, Trask. Maybe he's been doing more than just giving her shelter, if you take my meaning." Diego's shoulders tensed at the slur, but his voice remained steady. "I suggest you men ride back to town. Miss Trask has made her choice clear." "The hell she has!" Jeremiah swung down from his horse, stumbling slightly. His hand went to the pistol on his hip. "I'm not leaving without my daughter." Everything happened at once. Ghost lunged forward, snarling. Diego raised his rifle. Jeremiah drew his pistol with clumsy speed. The other men reached for their weapons. Ember screamed, "No!" In the chaos, Jeremiah's pistol discharged with a deafening crack. The bullet went wild, splintering a branch overhead and sending snow cascading down. Ghost's barking echoed off the mountainside. And then, cutting through it all, came a sharp command. "Everyone hold it right there!" Sheriff Amos Boyd emerged from the trees, his deputy beside him. They must have followed the three riders up the trail. The sheriff's revolver was already drawn, his weathered face stern. "Sheriff!" Jeremiah lowered his pistol, his voice taking on an ingratiating tone. "Thank God you're here. This half-breed kidnapped my Ember. Been holding her up here against her will all winter." "That's not true!" Ember protested again, but the sheriff raised his hand for silence. "Diego Hale," Boyd said heavily, "I've got a complaint sworn out against you for abducting a minor. Going to have to ask you to come with me." Diego slowly lowered his rifle. "Sheriff, you were there that day. You saw Trask sell his own daughter." "I saw a drunk man running his mouth," Boyd replied. "But the law's clear. She's under 16, and her father's her legal guardian. You had no right to take her, no matter your intentions." "But he saved me." Ember felt tears of frustration burning in her eyes. "Father would have sold me to worse men. Mr. Hale has been nothing but kind and decent. That's enough, girl," Jeremiah snapped. "You're coming home where you belong." The sheriff's deputy moved forward with a length of rope. "Your hands, Hale." For a long moment, Diego stood motionless. Ember could see the muscles in his jaw working, could sense him weighing his options. Ghost pressed against his leg, still growling softly. One word from Diego, and the wolfhound would attack. One quick movement, and he could have his rifle up again. But then his shoulders slumped slightly. Meeting Ember's terrified gaze, he shook his head once, a subtle warning not to make things worse. Slowly, he set his rifle down and held out his hands. "No," Ember whispered, as the deputy bound Diego's wrists. "Please, Sheriff Boyd, you can't do this. He's innocent." But no one seemed to hear her protests. Ghost whined in, confusion as Diego was led to the sheriff's horse. Jeremiah grabbed Ember's arm roughly, pulling her toward his own mount. "You'll thank me for this later," he muttered. "That savage could have done anything to you up here." Ember tried to pull away, her voice rising. "He never laid a hand on me. He treated me with more kindness than you ever did." But her words fell on deaf ears. She watched helplessly as Diego was mounted on the sheriff's spare horse, his bound hands gripping the saddle horn. His face was composed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the carefully controlled anger in his eyes. The small procession started down the mountain trail, the sheriff leading Diego's horse, the deputy following, and Jeremiah practically dragging Ember to his own mount. Ghost tried to follow, but Diego whistled sharply, commanding him to stay. The wolfhound sat in the snow, howling his protest as they descended into the valley. Ember caught one last glimpse of the cabin through her tears. Smoke still rising from the chimney, her half-made biscuits abandoned on the table, Ghost's lonely figure growing smaller in the distance. For 2 months, it had been a sanctuary of peace and simple kindness. Now, watching Diego's bowed head as they rode toward town, she wondered if she would ever see it again. The sun climbed higher in the cold February sky as they made their way down the mountain. The snow-crusted trail glinted mockingly, beautiful and indifferent to the injustice being done upon it. Ember's tears froze on her cheeks, and she prayed silently for God to protect the good man who had protected her, who was now bound and silent before her on the trail to Silver Creek. Ember stood in the doorway of Diego's cabin, watching until the last rider disappeared down the snow-crusted trail. Ghost pressed against her leg, whining softly. The wolfhound's confusion mirrored her own aching heart. How could something so wrong happen to someone so good? "Come on, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We've got work to do." Inside the cabin, the fire still crackled in the hearth, but the warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. Her half-finished biscuits sat abandoned on the rough-hewn table, a testament to how quickly everything had changed. She couldn't bear to look at them. Instead, Ember began gathering Diego's things with shaking hands, his spare shirt carefully mended, the worn Bible they'd read together during the long winter evenings, his good hunting knife and whetstone. She wrapped each item carefully in one of his clean shirts, trying to hold back her tears. "He'll need these," she told Ghost, who watched her every move with worried eyes. "They can't keep him in jail forever. He didn't do anything wrong." The wolfhound's tail thumped against the floorboards in response, but his eyes stayed fixed on the door, waiting for his master's return. Ember knew that feeling, the hollow ache of waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. But this time would be different. This time, she wouldn't just accept what happened. As darkness fell, she stoked the fire and tried to sleep in her usual corner. But rest wouldn't come. The cabin felt wrong without Diego's steady presence, without the sound of his quiet breathing from his bedroll near the hearth. Ghost paced restlessly, pausing occasionally to nose at Diego's empty blanket. "I know, boy," Ember murmured. "I miss him too." She spent that first night praying, her whispered words barely audible above the wind's moan through the pine boughs. "Please, Lord, keep him safe. Show me how to help him. Give me strength to do what's right." By morning, her path was clear. She couldn't stay here, safe in the cabin, while Diego sat in a jail cell for the crime of showing her kindness. The thought of facing her father's rage made her stomach clench with fear. But the thought of abandoning Diego was worse. Ember spent that day preparing. She packed Diego's things carefully in his old canvas bag, along with what food she could spare: dried meat, hard biscuits, the last of the coffee. She found his emergency money pouch tucked behind a loose board, 4 silver dollars and some copper pennies. The coins felt heavy with responsibility in her hand. Ghost watched as she checked the mule's harness, making sure everything was sound the way Diego had taught her. The sled runners looked good, though the wood was worn smooth from use. She loaded it with supplies, carefully securing everything under a tarpaulin. That second night was harder than the first. Tomorrow she would leave the safety of the cabin, the only place she'd known true peace since her mother died. What if she failed? What if they arrested her too? What if her father? Ghost's warm weight pressed against her side, offering comfort. Ember buried her face in his thick fur. "We have to try," she whispered. "He saved us both. Now it's our turn." Dawn broke clear and biting cold. Ember dressed in layers, her own clothes plus one of Diego's spare shirts for warmth. She tied her hair back tight under a wool scarf and pulled on the mittens he'd mended for her. Ghost watched eagerly as she hitched the mule to the sled. "Guard the cabin," she told the wolfhound firmly. "Stay." Ghost whined, clearly wanting to follow, but Diego had trained him well. He sat in the doorway, head lowered but alert, as Ember clicked her tongue at the mule and started down the trail. The descent was slower than she'd expected. The morning sun made the snow's crust treacherous, and she had to guide the mule carefully around patches of ice. The wind cut through her layers of clothing, making her eyes water and her cheeks sting. By midday, her legs ached from walking beside the sled, but she pressed on. As the sun began to set, Ember knew she couldn't reach town before dark. She found a sheltered spot beneath a stand of spruce trees, where the ground dipped slightly to block the wind. Following Diego's teaching, she unhitched the mule and rubbed him down thoroughly before securing him for the night. She gathered wood for a small fire, though her cold fingers fumbled with the matches. Under the tarpaulin, curled in Diego's spare blanket, Ember felt desperately alone. The night sounds were different here than at the cabin. Closer, somehow, more threatening. An owl's cry made her jump. Something rustled in the undergrowth nearby. "Be brave," she whispered to herself, remembering Diego's quiet strength. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She recited psalms until exhaustion finally pulled her into uneasy sleep. Her dreams were troubled. Diego in chains, her father's angry face, the jeering crowd from that terrible day at the auction block. Morning came with frost coating the tarpaulin. Ember's joints were stiff as she packed up camp, her fingers clumsy with cold as she hitched the mule again. The second day's travel was harder than the first. The trail grew steeper, more treacherous. Twice the sled nearly overturned on icy patches, and she had to fight to keep it upright. By late afternoon, Silver Creek came into view in the valley below. The sight of it made her stomach clench. Smoke rising from chimneys, the telegraph office's windows gleaming in the winter sun, the church steeple rising above the other buildings. Somewhere down there, Diego was locked in a cell. The sheriff's deputy spotted her as she guided the sled into town. He hurried to alert Sheriff Boyd, who emerged from his office with a troubled expression. "Miss Trask," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You shouldn't have come back here. Your father's mighty upset." Ember lifted her chin, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've come to help Mr. Hale. He's innocent, Sheriff. You know he is." Boyd sighed heavily, removing his hat to run a hand through his graying hair. "The law's the law, girl. He took a minor across county lines without guardian permission. That's kidnapping, no matter his intentions." "He saved me." Ember's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You were there, Sheriff. You saw what my father did, selling his own daughter like livestock." "Keep your voice down," Boyd warned, glancing around the street. "Listen here. Diego's being held for trial. Judge Warren arrives next week. Until then, I suggest you keep your distance and don't make things worse." "Can I see him?" Ember asked, hating how small her voice sounded. The sheriff shook his head. "Your father's forbidden it. You're still legally under his guardianship." Ember's hands clenched into fists inside her mittens. "Then I'll find somewhere else to stay. I won't go back to him." "The mission might take you in," Boyd said after a moment's consideration. "Sister Mary Catherine's got a soft heart for strays, but mind what I said about interfering with the law." Ember nodded stiffly, gathering the mule's reins. The mission stood at the edge of town, a diatanzutus weathered wooden building with a small cross mounted above the door. Sister Mary Catherine answered her knock, a thin woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Sheriff Boyd said you might be able to help me," Ember began hesitantly. "I need a place to stay, and I can work. I'm good at cooking and cleaning." The nun studied her face for a long moment. "You're Jeremiah Trask's girl, aren't you? The one that mountain man took?" "Mr. Hale saved me," Ember corrected firmly. "He never hurt me. He was taking me here, to the mission, when they arrested him." Sister Mary Catherine's expression softened. "Come in, child. We can always use another pair of hands in the kitchen. But you should know, your father's been by several times looking for you. He's not a man to cross lightly." "I know," Ember whispered, "but I can't let an innocent man hang for helping me." The nun showed her to a tiny room off the kitchen, little more than a closet with a narrow cot, but it was clean and warm. That night, after hours of scrubbing pots and floors, Ember knelt beside the cot with aching knees. She lit the stub of candle Sister Mary Catherine had given her, and opened Diego's Bible to the psalm they'd read together during the big storm. Words about justice and mercy, about God protecting the righteous. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "help me find a way to save him. He protected me when no one else would. Don't let him suffer for showing kindness to a stranger." The candle's flame cast shadows on the wall as Ember prayed, her whispered words fierce with determination. She would find a way to help Diego, no matter what it took. She wouldn't let him hang for the crime of being the only person who had treated her with real humanity since her mother died. Outside her window, the moon rose over Silver Creek's snow-covered streets. Somewhere in the jail, Diego sat in his cell, probably worried more about her safety than his own. Ember touched the rough leather cover of his Bible and made a solemn vow. She would prove his innocence, or die trying. The mission kitchen glowed with morning light as Ember kneaded bread dough, her arms aching from the repetitive motion. Sister Mary Catherine had assigned her to bake the daily loaves, including those delivered to the jail. The thought of possibly seeing Diego made her work faster, though her heart fluttered with anxiety. "Careful now," Sister Mary Catherine cautioned, watching Ember's quick movements. "Bread needs patience and a gentle touch." Ember nodded, forcing herself to slow down. By mid-morning, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with fresh-baked loaves. She wrapped 6 of them carefully in clean cloth, placed them in a basket, and set out toward the jail with determined steps. The February wind bit through her shawl as she hurried down Silver Creek's main street. A few townspeople nodded to her. They'd grown used to seeing her in her mission apron. But others turned away, whispering. Ember kept her chin up, though her cheeks burned with shame. At the jail, she found she wasn't the only visitor bringing food. A native woman stood at the desk, speaking quietly with Sheriff Boyd. She wore a long doe-skin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, and her silver-streaked hair was braided neatly. Despite her age, she stood straight-backed and dignified. The woman turned as Ember approached, her dark eyes kind but evaluating. "Ah," she said softly. "You must be the girl Diego protected." Ember clutched her basket tighter. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Ember Trask." "I am Wally." The woman's English was clear and precise. "I bring food for the prisoners each week. The sheriff knows me." Boyd nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Wally's been doing this for years. She has permission from the mission priests." "The mission bread," Ember said, setting her basket on the desk. "Sister Mary Catherine sent me." "Much obliged," Boyd said, checking the loaves. "But you know you can't see him, Miss Trask. Your father's orders still stand." Ember's shoulders slumped. Is he well, at least?" "He's bearing up," Wally answered before the sheriff could speak. "Diego is strong in spirit, like the mountains he calls home." Something in her tone made Ember look up sharply. This woman knew Diego, really knew him, not just as the quiet mountain man who kept to himself. "Come," Wally said, touching Ember's arm gently. "Walk with me. I believe we have much to discuss." Outside, they fell into step together, Wally matching her pace to Ember's shorter stride. They walked in silence until they reached the mission garden, where rough wooden benches stood empty in the winter sun. "You work in the mission kitchen now?" Wally asked as they sat. "Yes, ma'am. Sister Mary Catherine took me in." "She is a good woman." Wally studied Ember's face. "Would you share tea with me later? I have herbs that calm the spirit, and I think you could use some peace." Ember's eyes filled with unexpected tears. It had been so long since anyone but Diego had shown her such simple kindness. "I'd like that very much." "Good. I will come at sunset." Wally's smile was warm. "And please, call me Wally. Ma'am makes me feel like a stranger." That evening, Wally arrived carrying a leather pouch of dried herbs and a small copper kettle. Sister Mary Catherine provided cups and welcomed Wally warmly, clearly familiar with her. They settled in the kitchen as the herb tea steeped, filling the air with a sweet, woodsy scent. "I've known Diego Hale for many years," Wally began, pouring the tea. "He saved my brother's life when a mining accident trapped him underground. Diego dug for 2 days straight, refusing to give up even when others said it was hopeless." Ember wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup. "That sounds like him. He's so steady, strong." "Yes." Wally's eyes grew distant. "He was different then, younger, more hopeful. He had a good ranch near Durango, and he'd just married my niece, Sahana." "Diego was married to your niece?" Ember whispered. Wally nodded. "Sahana was like a daughter to me. She saw past the quiet man to his gentle heart. They were so happy, especially when their son was born." Her voice softened with old grief. "But that winter, fever swept through our people. Sahana and the baby. They did not survive." Ember's heart ached. She remembered Diego's broken voice saying, "Had a wife once. She'd have wanted me to." "After their deaths, everything fell apart," Wally continued. "Some men in town had always resented Diego for marrying a Ute woman. They used his grief against him, claiming he had no right to the ranch since his wife was dead. The law sided with them, though the priests tried to help." "That's not fair," Ember burst out. "He'd worked that land, built a life there." "No, it wasn't fair, but Diego didn't fight it. He said there'd been enough bitterness and hate. He took to the mountains instead, living by trapping and occasional carpentry work. Many thought he'd gone wild, but I knew better. He was seeking peace in the high places, trying to honor Sahana's memory by living with dignity." Ember wiped tears from her cheeks. "No wonder he helped me. He knows what it's like to be treated as less than human." "Yes." Wally touched Ember's hand. "And now we must help him. I've been thinking about how to approach the territorial judge when he arrives." "Can we?" Ember asked eagerly. "I'll do anything to help prove Diego's innocent." The The judge is a fair man, but he respects proper procedure. We must write a formal petition for mercy, explaining the true circumstances." Wally reached into her dress pocket and withdrew paper, pen, and ink. "I will show you how to phrase it correctly." For the next hour, Wally guided Ember through composing the petition. She taught her the formal language needed, how to address the judge respectfully, and how to present the facts clearly without emotional excess. Ember's hand shook as she wrote, but Wally's steady presence helped her focus. "Your father's actions were wrong," Wally said as they worked, "but we must be careful how we present that. The judge will want to see that Diego acted to protect you, not to steal you away." "He never touched me," Ember said fiercely. "He gave me his cabin's only bed and slept by the fire. He taught me to read better using his Bible. Her voice broke. "He treated me like I mattered." "Put that in the petition," Wally advised. "Show the judge Diego's character through his actions, not just our words about him." They wrote multiple drafts, Wally patiently correcting Ember's phrasing until the petition read both properly and persuasively. The final version detailed the public sale, Diego's intervention, his clear intent to bring Ember to the mission when weather permitted, and his consistent respect for her safety and dignity. "Now," Wally said as they finished, "we must gather signatures from respectable townspeople who will support this account. I will speak to the mission priests and the doctor. Perhaps Sister Mary Catherine will help too." "Do you think it will be enough?" Ember asked, carefully blotting the ink. "We must have faith," Wally replied. "Diego has always believed that justice and mercy can work together, like rain and sunshine helping seeds grow. Now we must prove him right." She gathered her things to leave, but paused at the kitchen door. "You know, Ember, Sahana would have liked you. She believed in seeing the light in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Ember clutched the precious petition pages. "I wish I could have known her." "In a way, you do. Through Diego's kindness. He learned that from her." Wally smiled gently. "Get some rest now, child. Tomorrow we begin gathering signatures, and you'll need your strength." After Wally left, Ember sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about Diego's loss, his quiet dignity, and the way he'd turned his own pain into compassion for others. She touched the petition pages, remembering how carefully he'd taught her to read difficult words in his Bible, how he'd mended her clothes without being asked, how he'd never once made her feel worthless or unwanted. "I won't let you down," she whispered, as if he could hear her. "You saved me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to help save you." Sister Mary Catherine found her there and gently shooed her off to bed. But Ember lay awake long into the night, practicing in her head how she would approach people for signatures, praying for the right words to convince them of Diego's innocence. The petition felt like a small thing against the weight of prejudice and misunderstanding, but it was a start. A way to speak truth to power, to shine light into darkness. Outside her window, the stars wheeled above Silver Creek's sleeping streets, bright and cold as justice. Somewhere in his cell, Diego kept his own vigil, perhaps reading his worn Bible by lamplight, perhaps praying for the strength to face whatever came with the same quiet grace he'd always shown. Ember pulled her blanket tighter and whispered one final prayer of thanks for Wally's help and wisdom. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had hope, and that was no small thing. The mission kitchen became Ember's sanctuary in the weeks that followed. Steam rose from enormous copper pots as she stirred thick stew alongside Sister Mary Catherine, the rhythmic motion soothing her worried mind. The kitchen's warmth wrapped around her like a blessing, so different from the bitter cold of her father's neglect. "More carrots in this batch," Sister Mary Catherine instructed, her weathered hands guiding Ember's movements. "The miners need the vitamins, especially in winter. Ember nodded, dropping chunks of orange root vegetables into the bubbling pot. Through the kitchen window, she could see the jail where Diego waited. Her heart ached, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Each day of good work brought her closer to helping him. The dinner bell rang promptly at 5 o'clock each evening. Miners shuffled in, their faces dark with coal dust, alongside small children with hollow cheeks and patched clothing. Ember ladled stew into tin bowls, making sure the orphans got extra portions. She recognized the hunger in their eyes, not just for food, but for kindness. "Thank you, miss," a small boy whispered as she slipped him an extra piece of cornbread. His gratitude reminded her of her first meal in Diego's cabin, how he had served her with quiet dignity despite her shame. During quiet afternoons, between cooking and cleaning, Ember practiced her writing. Sister Mary Catherine provided paper and pencils, watching approvingly as Ember's letters grew neater, more confident. The petition for Diego's release took shape slowly, each draft more precise than the last. "You must tell the whole truth," Wally advised during her visits. "Show how your father treated you, but also Diego's honorable intentions. The judge will want facts, not just feelings." Ember wrote carefully. "Mr. Diego Hale purchased me at public auction to save me from worse fate. He provided shelter, safety, and respect. His intent was always to bring me to the mission when weather permitted. He never acted with anything but honor." The mission sisters read her work, offering suggestions and support. Sister Mary Catherine's signature was the first on the petition, her writing bold and clear. Sister Margaret and Sister Elizabeth added theirs, along with testimonials about Ember's character and Diego's reputation for honest dealing. "The truth will prevail," Sister Mary Catherine assured her, but her eyes were worried. The worry grew when Wally brought disturbing news from town. She found Ember scrubbing pots one afternoon, her normally calm face troubled. "Your father has been drinking at the saloon," Wally said quietly. "He boasts of plans to sell your labor contract to Marcus Wade when the trial ends." Ember's hands trembled on the pot rim. Everyone knew Wade ran the brothel on the edge of town. "He can't," she whispered. "I'm not his to sell anymore." "The law is unclear," Wally admitted. "Much depends on the judge's ruling about Diego's actions." Fear clawed at Ember's throat. Running away tempted her. She could vanish into the mountains like Diego had done, but that would only prove her father's lies about Diego kidnapping her. "I won't run," she said finally. Her voice shook but grew stronger. "I have to stand up and speak the truth, for Diego's sake and my own." That night, she wrote another letter by lamplight in the mission's small chapel. The candles cast dancing shadows as she poured out her heart to the territorial judge. "Your Honor, I beg permission to speak at Mr. Hale's trial. I am the one they claim was kidnapped, but that is false. I was sold like property by a father who saw me as worthless. Mr. Hale acted with Christian charity to protect me. He treated me with more respect than my own blood. Please let me tell the truth before God and the court." Wally took the letter, tucking it carefully into her leather pouch. "The snow is deep between here and Durango," she said, "but I will get this to the judge." "Thank you," Ember whispered, hugging her friend. "Be careful on the trail." "I have ridden these mountains since childhood," Wally assured her with a smile. "The spirits of my ancestors will guide me." After Wally left, Ember established her evening vigil in the chapel. Each night, she knelt before the small altar, the lamp's glow warming the rough wooden cross on the wall. Her prayers rose like smoke. "Lord, give me strength to face what's coming. Help me find the right words. Protect Diego, comfort him in his cell. Show us all your justice and mercy." Some nights, doubt crept in like the winter wind. What if the judge refused to hear her? What if her father's influence proved too strong? What if Diego went to prison for the crime of being kind? But then she would remember Diego's quiet strength, how he had faced loss and injustice without letting bitterness poison his heart. She thought of Wally's courage, riding through snow-filled passes to deliver truth to power. She recalled Sister Mary Catherine's steady faith that right would prevail. The sisters found her asleep in the chapel more than once, her head pillowed on her arms before the altar. They never scolded, only covered her with a blanket and let her rest in that peaceful place. During the days, she threw herself into mission work with fierce determination. She learned to bake bread in the huge ovens, the physical labor helping calm her fears. She taught younger children their letters while practicing her own writing. She mended clothes and blankets, each stitch a small act of order against chaos. The other workers at the mission began to rely on her calm presence. "You have a gift for service," Sister Elizabeth told her. "The children trust you." It was true. The orphans especially seemed to sense her understanding of their wounds. They brought her their small troubles, torn socks, empty stomachs, nightmares about lost parents. She listened and helped where she could, remembering how Diego had listened to her own hurts without judgment. One small girl, Sarah, came to the kitchen crying one day. "Tommy said I'm nobody 'cause I got no family," she sobbed. Ember gathered her close. "You are somebody very special," she said firmly. "God knows your name and your worth. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words were as much for herself as for Sarah. Each day of waiting tested her faith, but also strengthened it. She was not the same frightened girl who had stood on that auction block. Diego's kindness and Wally's wisdom had helped her find her own courage. Week after week, she kept her vigil by the chapel lamp. Outside its circle of light, winter tightened its grip on Silver Creek. Miners coughed in the streets, children huddled closer to the mission's fires, and somewhere on the snowy trails, Wally carried a letter that might change everything. Ember touched the rough wood of the chapel cross, remembering Diego's tattered Bible and his quiet faith. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, speaking truth. She was not worthless. She was not property to be sold. She was a child of God with a voice and a purpose. The lamp flickered, but did not go out. Like hope, it burned steady in the darkness, waiting for dawn. The early spring sun fought through heavy clouds as muddy snow melted in Silver Creek's streets. Wagon wheels creaked through the slush, carrying townsfolk toward the courthouse. The wooden building stood like a stern judge itself, its windows reflecting the gray morning light. Ember smoothed her borrowed dress, clean but plain, lent by Sister Mary Catherine. Her hands trembled as she climbed the courthouse steps beside Wally. The Ute woman's presence steadied her, like a rock in rushing water. "Remember," Wally whispered, "speak your truth with a strong heart." Inside, the courthouse smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, rough benches filled with miners, merchants, and mission workers. The sisters sat together, their habits stark against the crowd's muddy colors. Sheriff Turner stood by the door, his badge gleaming dully. When they brought Diego in, Ember's heart clenched. 3 months in jail had left him gaunt, his face pale beneath his beard. Iron chains clinked at his wrists, but he held his head high. His eyes met hers briefly, carrying the same gentle strength she remembered from the cabin. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping as he took his seat. The territorial judge had ridden through spring storms from Durango to hear the case. His weathered face gave nothing away as he studied the papers before him. "The territory brings charges of kidnapping and corruption of a minor against Diego Hale," the clerk announced, his voice echoing in the hushed room. Jeremiah Trask swaggered to the front, cleaned up but still carrying the smell of whiskey. He launched into his accusations, painting himself as a concerned father whose daughter had been stolen by a half-breed mountain man. "He took advantage, Your Honor," Jeremiah declared, his voice thick with false grief. "Seduced my innocent girl away from her loving home. Who knows what evil he done to her up in them mountains?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ember's hands clenched in her lap, each lie striking like a physical blow. Diego stood silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Mr. Hale," Judge Harrison said, "how do you answer these charges?" Diego's voice was rough from disuse but steady. "I acted to protect the girl, Your Honor. Nothing more." "He's lying," Jeremiah shouted. "Ask anyone who was there. He bought her like property." "Because you were selling her like property," a clear voice rang out. Ember had risen to her feet, her heart pounding but her voice carrying through the sudden silence. "Your Honor, please let me speak." Judge Harrison studied her thoughtfully, then nodded. "Come forward, Miss Trask." Ember walked to the front, feeling every eye upon her. Her legs shook, but she remembered Diego's quiet courage, Wally's wisdom, the sister's faith in her. She faced the judge and began to speak. "What my father says is false," she said. "He put me up for auction outside the saloon last winter, calling me worthless and useless. He would have sold me to anyone with coin, no matter their intentions." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Mr. Hale paid $5 silver, not to use me, but to save me." The courthouse had grown so quiet she could hear the wind mourning through the eaves. Even Jeremiah seemed struck dumb. "Tell us what happened after he purchased you," Judge Harrison prompted. Ember described the journey to Diego's cabin, her voice steady now. "He gave me his coat when I was cold. He shared his food and never once made me feel afraid. At the cabin, he gave me clean clothes and a warm place to sleep, alone and safe. He told me straight away he meant to take me to the mission when spring came." She turned to face the crowd, meeting their eyes. "In all those weeks, Mr. Hale never touched me, never spoke an unkind word. He taught me to split wood and tend the fire. He let me read his Bible. He treated me with more respect than I'd known in years." Gasps and whispers rustled through the room. Several women dabbed at their eyes. Jeremiah's face had gone purple with rage. "She's lying to protect him," he shouted. "He's corrupted her mind." "I speak nothing but truth before God," Ember declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "The only corruption was a father willing to sell his daughter to save his pride." Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "The court will hear from Wally of the Ute people." Wally rose gracefully, her bearing regal despite the hostile stares of some townspeople. She spoke in clear, measured tones about Diego's history, his marriage to her friend Sahana, their tragic deaths, his years of quiet service to both settlers and Ute people. "I have known Diego Hale for many years," she said. "When my brother lay dying of snakebite, Diego carried him 2 days through the mountains to our healer. He has always shown respect to our people, learned our ways, dealt honestly in trade." Her dark eyes swept the room. "The man you see before you is no kidnapper. He is a protector of the weak, a man of honor who has suffered much but keeps his faith." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "You can vouch for his character without reservation?" "I stake my own honor on his," Wally replied firmly. "He is known among my people as Quiet Heart, one who acts with wisdom and compassion." More whispers filled the room. Ember saw faces changing as the truth sank in. Diego was not the villain they had imagined. Even some of the men who had jeered at her auction looked ashamed now. The judge called for order, his gavel cracking like thunder. "Mr. Trask, do you deny that you publicly offered your daughter for sale?" Jeremiah sputtered. "It wasn't like that. I was just—" "Answer the question," Judge Harrison commanded. "Did you or did you not attempt to sell your own flesh and blood?" The silence stretched thin as wire before Jeremiah muttered. "Yes." "And did you receive payment from Mr. Hale?" $5, Jeremiah admitted sullenly. "Which you spent at the saloon that very night," Sister Mary Catherine called out, unable to contain herself. Several townspeople nodded, remembering. Judge Harrison's face had grown stern. "Mr. Trask, I find your conduct reprehensible. The sale of human beings is expressly forbidden by territorial law. You, sir, are the true criminal here." He turned to Diego. "Mr. Hale, while your methods were unorthodox, I believe you acted from genuine humanitarian concern. The testimony of Miss Trask and Wally speaks powerfully to your character." He lifted his gavel. "I hereby dismiss all charges against Diego Hale and order his immediate release." The gavel fell with a sharp crack. The bailiff moved to unlock Diego's chains, while the crowd erupted in conversation. Ember's knees went weak with relief. Sister Mary Catherine hurried forward to steady her, smiling through tears. "The truth has prevailed," she whispered, "just as we prayed it would." But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I find Jeremiah Trask unfit for guardianship. Miss Trask, you are hereby made a ward of the mission until you come of age. Mr. Trask, you will face charges for your actions. Sheriff Turner, take him into custody." Jeremiah began to bluster, but the sheriff's heavy hand fell on his shoulder. As he was led away, Ember felt a great weight lift from her spirit. She was free, truly free at last. Diego stood quietly amid the chaos, still thin and worn, but with peace in his eyes. Wally touched his arm gently. "Welcome back to the living, my friend." Ember approached him hesitantly. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Diego's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "No, thank you. Your courage today was something to behold." The courthouse slowly emptied as people filed out into the muddy street. Sister Mary Catherine spoke quietly with Judge Harrison about Ember's placement at the mission. Wally gathered her shawl, preparing to leave. Through the windows, Ember could see the snow melting on the mountains. Spring was coming at last, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. She thought of the little chapel where she had kept her vigil, of Diego's cabin where she had found safety, of all the paths that had led to this moment of truth and justice. The morning light grew stronger, touching everything with gold. Diego's freed hands, Wally's serene face. The worn Bible Sister Mary Catherine carried, the judge's solemn bench. In that light, Ember saw clearly at last. She was not worthless or unwanted. She was a child of God who had found her voice, speaking truth that set an innocent man free. Outside, wagon wheels creaked through the mud, carrying news of justice done in Silver Creek that spring morning. The mountains stood witness, their snowy peaks catching the light like silver coins, not spent in shame this time, but transformed into something precious: mercy, truth, and freedom. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him. The momentary elation in the courthouse died as he spoke his next words. However, regarding custody of the minor, Ember Trask. He paused, his expression grave. While Mr. Trask's behavior was deplorable, territorial law is clear. A father retains legal custody of his children until they reach the age of 18, barring proof of grievous physical harm. The words fell like stones in still water. Ember's heart stopped. Beside her, Sister Mary Catherine drew in a sharp breath. "Your Honor," the nun protested, "surely after what we've heard—" "I understand your concern, Sister," Judge Harrison interrupted, raising his hand. "But the law provides no grounds for terminating parental rights in this case. Miss Trask will return to her father's custody until she comes of age." Jeremiah's face split into a triumphant smirk. He straightened his worn vest, already playing the role of the wronged father reclaiming his daughter. Ember felt the walls closing in around her. "As for you, Mr. Hale," the judge continued, turning to Diego, "while you are cleared of kidnapping charges, your presence has caused considerable disruption in this community. For your own safety, and to prevent further conflict, I order you to leave this county by sundown today." Diego stood silent, his face impossible to read. Only his hands, clenched at his sides, betrayed his emotion. "Your Honor, please," Ember's voice cracked. "He only tried to help me." "My ruling stands," Judge Harrison declared firmly. "This court is adjourned." The gavel's crack echoed like a gunshot. The bailiff began ushering people toward the door. Ember tried to move toward Diego, but Jeremiah's hand clamped onto her arm. "Time to go home, girl," he growled softly. "You've caused enough trouble." Diego's eyes met hers across the emptying courtroom. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the sheriff stepped between them. "Best get moving, Hale," the lawman warned. "Sun's already starting to set." Wally touched Ember's other arm gently. "Be strong, little sister," she whispered. "The Creator sees all." Ember watched helplessly as Diego was escorted out. Sister Mary Catherine pressed a small Bible into her hands before Jeremiah pulled her away. "Keep faith," the nun murmured. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy street. Jeremiah marched Ember past the saloon, past the general store where women whispered behind their hands, past the livery where Diego was silently loading his mule with supplies. She caught one last glimpse of him as they reached her father's shanty at the edge of town. He stood on the rise above Silver Creek, watching from afar as Jeremiah thrust her through the door. In the fading light, he looked like a spirit from one of Wally's stories, a guardian forced to stand witness to suffering he could not prevent. The door slammed shut. The single room smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed blankets. Jeremiah immediately went to the cupboard where he kept his bottle. "Thought you could shame me in front of the whole town, did you?" he snarled, pulling out the cork with his teeth. "Telling tales about your poor father?" "They weren't tales," Ember said quietly. "They were truth." The back of his hand caught her across the face, sending her stumbling into the rough wall. "Truth?" he spat. "Truth is you're my daughter, and you'll do as you're told until I say otherwise." Ember touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her lip had split. She thought of Diego's cabin, the peace there, the respect, the simple kindness. Now it felt like a dream, fading in the face of this harsh reality. She curled up on her thin pallet in the corner as darkness fell, clutching Sister Mary Catherine's Bible to her chest. Through the ill-fitting window boards, she could hear the wind mourning in the pines. Somewhere out there, Diego was making camp one last time in the county that had rejected him. Her tears fell silently as she prayed for strength. Morning came too soon. Ember rose before dawn to make coffee, hoping to avoid her father's temper. But Jeremiah was already awake, drinking from a fresh bottle. His eyes were red-rimmed and dangerous. "Making yourself useful finally?" he sneered as she stirred up the fire. "Learned some skills while you were playing house with that half-breed?" Ember kept her eyes down, focusing on the coffee pot. Every lesson in dignity she'd learned from Diego and Wally told her to stay silent in the face of his baiting. "Look at me when I'm talking to you!" Jeremiah roared suddenly, surging to his feet. The bottle crashed against the wall, sending glass and whiskey raining down. "Think you're better than me now? Think that mountain man taught you to look down on your own father?" "No, sir," Ember whispered. But it was too late. Jeremiah's rage had been building since the trial, fueled by wounded pride and morning whiskey. "Shamed me in front of the judge," he ranted, pacing the small room. "Made me look like some kind of monster. After everything I've done for you, fed you, clothed you, put up with your lazy ways year after year." His voice rose with each word. Ember pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself smaller. She could smell the whiskey on his breath as he loomed over her. "Maybe it's time I taught you some real respect," he growled. "Since that's what you're so concerned about these days." The first blow caught her shoulder as she tried to duck away. Ember's world narrowed to survival, to protecting her head as Jeremiah's fury found its target. Each impact brought memories of the cabin, Diego's gentle hands showing her how to set a trap, Wally's wise smile, Sister Mary Catherine's prayers. She clung to them like a lifeline as darkness gathered at the edges of her vision. "Please," she gasped finally. "Father, please stop." Whether it was her plea or simple exhaustion that stayed his hand, Jeremiah stumbled back. He stared at her crumpled form as if seeing her for the first time, then grabbed his coat. "Clean up this mess," he muttered. "I need a drink." The door banged shut behind him. Ember lay still for a long moment, testing which movements brought the most pain. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself to sitting. Glass crunched under her hands as she used the wall for support. Morning light streamed through the gaps in the walls, catching the shards of the broken bottle. They glittered like the snow on Diego's mountain, like tears on Wally's cheeks, like hope scattered and sharp-edged on the dirty floor. Ember touched her swollen lip, remembering Diego's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "If trouble comes, don't be afraid." But he was gone now, driven away by the very law that had failed to protect her. She was alone with her father's demons once more. With trembling hands, she began to pick up the broken glass. Each piece was a reminder of how quickly freedom could shatter, how easily justice could bend toward cruelty. Outside, she could hear Silver Creek waking up. Wagon wheels, merchants' calls, children's voices. Normal sounds from a town that had witnessed her triumph and her fall in the space of a single day. The coffee pot still hung over the dying fire, forgotten in the chaos. Ember poured a cup with shaking hands, sipping slowly as morning crept across the shanty floor. She had survived the night. She would survive the next and the next, until God showed her a way forward. Through the window, she could see the mountains where Diego's empty cabin stood. Snow still capped the highest peaks, gleaming in the dawn light like a distant promise. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Diego was riding away from Silver Creek, carrying with him the memory of a girl who had found her voice too briefly. Ember touched the small Bible in her pocket, feeling its worn leather beneath her fingers. Sister Mary Catherine's words echoed in her mind. "Keep faith." She straightened her shoulders despite the pain, preparing to face whatever the day might bring. The law had failed her, but she held on to the truth that had shone so clearly in the courthouse. She was not worthless. She was not alone. And somehow, someday, she would find her way back to freedom. A week dragged by like molasses in winter. Ember's bruises faded from purple to yellow, but the fear in her gut only grew sharper. She heard the whispers. Jeremiah was desperate for money again. He needed to pay off his debts at the saloon. That evening, boots scraped on the porch. Ember looked up from where she knelt, stirring the stew pot. Jeremiah stumbled in with Rusk Tanner close behind him. The saloon-keeper's eyes crawled over her like insects, measuring and calculating. "Girl's strong enough," Rusk said, scratching his chin. "Could use help in the kitchen, washing glasses, serving drinks. Might even teach her to pour proper. Jeremiah nodded eagerly. "She's learned to work this past winter. That mountain man taught her good habits. I'll give him that much." Ember's hands trembled as she ladled stew into bowls. The men ignored her, settling at the rough table to haggle over her future. A bottle appeared from Rusk's coat. $20 a month, Rusk offered, plus room and board in the back. More than fair for untrained help. 30, Jeremiah countered. She's worth that much just for looks. Brings in thirsty men just having her around. Ember's stomach turned. She busied herself hanging the wet laundry they had brought in before dark, trying to make herself invisible. The kerosene lantern on the table flickered as the men's voices grew louder, more heated. 25, final offer, Rusk said. And you stay out of my place till you settle your tab. Jeremiah's fist hit the table. That wasn't our deal. You said we'd clear the slate when... His elbow caught the lantern. It toppled, spilling burning oil across the tablecloth. Flames leaped up the threadbare curtains behind them. Fire! Ember screamed. She grabbed a blanket, trying to smother the flames, but they had already caught the dry wood of the wall. Smoke filled the small cabin. Rusk shoved past her, coughing and cursing. Jeremiah staggered after him, leaving the door open to the snowy night. Wind whipped through, feeding the fire until it roared like a hungry beast. Help! Ember ran into the street, her throat raw. Fire! Someone help! But the cabin stood at the edge of town. By the time people began running toward her cries, the roof was fully involved. Ember watched in horror as the walls groaned and buckled. The whole structure collapsed in a shower of sparks that hissed in the falling snow. Through the smoke and confusion, she heard Jeremiah's voice. Where is she? Girl, get back here! Terror seized her. She couldn't go back. Not to him. Not to Rusk's saloon. Without conscious thought, her feet carried her away from the light of the burning cabin, away from the gathering crowd, into the darkness beyond town. Snow was falling harder now, big wet flakes that stuck to her shawl. Ember ran blindly, stumbling over rocks and roots. The small Bible sister Mary Catherine had given her was clutched tight against her chest, its leather binding warm from her grip. Behind her, voices called out, growing fainter as she climbed higher into the foothills. The town's lights disappeared in the thickening snow. Wind cut through her thin clothes, but fear drove her onward. She had no plan, no destination except away, but her feet seemed to know the path, carrying her toward the mountains where Diego's cabin stood empty. Whether she could find it in the dark and snow, she didn't know. Whether she would freeze trying, she didn't dare think about. All she knew was that she couldn't go back, couldn't let them sell her to Rusk's saloon, couldn't bear her father's rages anymore. The fire had burned her last bridge to that life. Snow filled her boots. Her hands grew numb. Still she pushed on, using the darker shapes of pine trees as guides. The Bible was her only possession now, but its presence gave her courage. Somewhere ahead lay the trail Diego had shown her, winding up toward timberline and safety. If she could just keep moving, if she could just stay ahead of whatever pursuit might follow, if she could just find her way through the storm. Ember stumbled on, alone in the wilderness, while snowflakes erased her tracks behind her. Meanwhile, far to the south, Diego Hale rode along the frozen river, his mule's hooves crunching through crusted snow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, but he found no peace in the familiar wilderness. Guilt gnawed at his heart like a hungry wolf. He had failed Ember, just as he had failed Sahana years ago. When dusk approached, he made camp beneath a stand of towering pines. The ridge above offered some shelter from the bitter wind. After tending to his mule, Diego knelt beside his small fire, removed his hat, and bowed his head. Lord, he whispered hoarsely, I need your guidance. That girl trusted me to protect her, and I left her there. His voice broke. Show me what's right. Give me a sign. The flames crackled, sending sparks upward into the darkening sky. Diego stayed on his knees, searching his conscience. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the sharp scent of coming snow. Something else shifted too, deep in his spirit. An urgent certainty gripped him, as clear as morning light. Ember was in danger. Without hesitation, Diego doused his fire and saddled up. Though sleet stung his face and exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, he turned his mule northward. Hour after hour they pushed through the storm, the animal struggling in the deepening drifts. Near midnight, the sleet turned to heavy snow. Diego dismounted to lead his tired mule, scanning the ground. There, barely visible in the fresh powder, were small boot prints heading toward the timber. His heart pounded against his ribs as he recognized the size and pattern. Ember had passed this way, alone in the deadly cold. Diego tightened his grip on the reins and followed the tracks, praying they would lead him to her before the storm erased them completely. The darkness descended like a heavy blanket, and the swirling snow nearly blinded Diego as he pressed forward. His mule struggled through drifts that reached past its knees. The tracks grew fainter with each passing minute as fresh powder filled them in. His heart nearly stopped when he spotted a dark shape near the creek bank. There, half buried under white drifts, lay Ember's crumpled form. Diego leaped from his mount and rushed to her side, his boots breaking through the crusty surface of the snow. Ember! His voice caught in his throat as he lifted her limp body into his arms. Her skin felt like ice, her lips blue from cold. Working quickly, he wrapped her in his heavy wool coat and cradled her against his chest. The cabin wasn't far. He could make out its dark shape through the curtain of white. Inside the familiar shelter, Diego laid her gently by the cold hearth. His fingers trembled as he struck flint to steel, coaxing flames from the dry kindling he'd left behind weeks ago. Soon the fire crackled, pushing back the deadly chill. He warmed broth over the flames while rubbing life back into her frozen hands. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. I thought, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. I thought God forgot me. Diego's throat tightened as he helped her sit up, holding the warm broth to her lips. He never forgets who's been sold cheap, he said softly. He buys them back himself. Tears slid down Ember's cheeks, mixing with the steam rising from the cup. Outside, snow hissed against the window panes like whispered prayers of thanksgiving, while inside, the fire's warmth wrapped around them both like a father's embrace. The mountain air grew warmer as days stretched into a gentle rhythm of healing. Ember's strength returned slowly, like the spring sun melting winter's grip. Diego tended her frost-nipped fingers with pine salve, his touch careful and sure. Ghost rarely left her side, his bulk a warm comfort against her blanket at night. Reckon this old cabin needs tending too, Diego said one morning, eyeing the collapsed porch. Together they salvaged boards and straightened bent nails. Ember held the planks steady while Diego's hammer rang out across the clearing. The work felt right, like mending something broken inside them both. Between chores, they scrubbed the cabin's smoke-stained walls. The rhythmic motion of their brushes filled comfortable silences. Sometimes Ember would hum a hymn, and Diego would nod along, a peace settling over his weathered features. How do you forgive someone who threw you away? Ember asked one evening as they rested on the newly built porch. The question had weighed on her heart since the fire. Diego was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the snow-patched meadow. Same way the Lord forgives us, I reckon. One day at a time, choosing mercy over what's owed. Like you did with Ghost? She scratched the wolfhound's ears. And like Sahana taught me, Diego said softly, speaking of his late wife. She showed me love's stronger than hurt. Ember studied his face in the fading light. Will you keep wandering? After everything? A gentle smile touched Diego's lips. Maybe God meant me to stay still long enough to build again. He gestured to the fresh-cut lumber and the cabin behind them. Some things need roots to grow strong. Outside, the warming earth revealed delicate purple crocuses pushing through melting snow. Their shared silence felt different now, not heavy with loneliness, but rich with possibility and healing. The mountain snow retreated day by day until wagon wheels could finally grip the muddy trails. One bright morning, the creak of wooden axles and the gentle clip-clop of hooves echoed through the clearing. Wally sat tall in the mission's wagon seat, her dark eyes bright with joy at finding both Ember and Diego alive. "The Lord guided me here," Wally said, embracing Ember. "We feared the worst when word came of the fire." She turned to Diego with respectful grace. "The mission board has agreed to take guardianship of Ember until she comes of age. Pastor Graves himself signed the papers." Ember's eyes welled with tears of relief. Diego helped them load her few belongings into the wagon, his movements deliberate and gentle. At the mission, Diego found purpose in the rhythm of repair work. His hammer rang against the chapel roof as he replaced rotted shingles, while below, older boys watched eagerly. Soon he was teaching them the ways of wood and nail, showing them how to plane boards smooth and join corners true. Ember bloomed like a spring flower in fertile soil. Each evening, she gathered the mission children around the lamplight, her voice strong and clear as she read from Scripture. Their small faces glowed with wonder at the stories, and her laughter, once so rare, now flowed freely among them. During the evening meal, Pastor Graves rose from his seat, his kind eyes moving from Diego to the fresh-built shelves and mended pews. "Brother," he said quietly, "you have taught us what mercy truly looks like." Diego ducked his head at the praise, but his gaze drifted to Ember across the dining hall. Pride warmed his weathered features as he watched her serving bread to the youngest children, her movements sure and peaceful. In her gentle strength, he saw the harvest of seeds planted in kindness. Summer painted the mountain valley in vibrant hues. Wild lupines dotted the mission grounds with purple spears, and golden sunlight warmed the weathered chapel walls. In the yard, Diego's workbench stood surrounded by fresh wood shavings, the sweet scent of pine mixing with warm afternoon air. His strong hands moved steadily over new desktops, planing them smooth for the mission school. Neat rows of finished pews waited nearby, their surfaces gleaming with care and craft. The steady rhythm of his work filled the yard, sawing, sanding, fitting pieces together with quiet precision. The creak of the kitchen door caught his attention. Ember emerged carrying a woven basket, her steps light across the sun-dappled grass. She'd, grown stronger these past months, her face glowing with health and purpose. Children's voices drifted from the schoolroom behind her, reciting their lessons. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the basket on his workbench. The aroma of fresh bread and stewed beans wafted up. Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she added, "You know, I still owe you $5. Diego paused in his work, a slow smile warming his weathered features. "Then I reckon you'd best stay till the debt's paid," he replied softly. The words held gentle teasing, but something deeper, too. The quiet contentment of two souls finding harbor after storm. Near the chapel steps, Wally looked up from her mending, dark eyes twinkling as she watched them. Her laugh was soft and knowing, like wind through summer leaves. The sound of it made Ember's heart lighter still. The church bells began to ring, their clear tones floating across the valley. Ember closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. In that moment, understanding bloomed in her heart like a flower opening to light. God hadn't saved her merely to survive. He'd lifted her from darkness so she could help light the way for others, just as Diego and Wally had done for her. Joy bubbled up from deep within, spilling out as laughter. The sound rang pure and free, dancing with the bell's sweet chime. It echoed off the chapel walls and rolled down the green valley, carrying with it all the grace of second chances and hearts made whole. Diego set down his plane, watching her with quiet pride. Wally's needle caught sunlight as she nodded, smiling. And there in the mission yard, surrounded by the works of healing hands and faithful hearts, Ember's laughter sang out the truth of mercy's triumph. How love could purchase what was precious, mend what was broken, and make a family from those once lost and alone. The bells rang on, and summer light blessed them all as they shared bread and gratitude in the shade of the mission walls, where hope had finally found its home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.